I want to tell you something, and I want you to listen carefully before you dismiss me as just another bitter old bloke who got what he deserved. I am 62 years old. I spent 40 years on my hands and knees in ceiling cavities, in crawl spaces, in the guts of buildings that other people would go on to fill with their lives, and their noise and their business. I wired hospitals. I wired schools. I wired 3 different council estates in Western Sydney, and a shopping center in Parramatta that's still standing today. I know how electricity works. I understand current and resistance and load, and the precise way that power moves from one place to another. I thought I understood it better than most. What I didn't understand, what I couldn't have understood, because nothing in 40 years of trade work prepares you for it, is how money can flow out of your life in exactly the same way, silently, invisibly, along pathways you didn't even know existed, one forged document at a time. I lost £230,000 in 14 months. That's the number. I want you to hold it in your head while I tell you this story, because by the end of it, you're going to think that number makes sense. You're going to nod along at every step and think, yes, I can see how that happened. I can see the logic of it. And that's the point. That's exactly the point. It always makes sense when someone else is living it. The problem is when it's you. My name is Brian. I'll use my real name because I'm past the point of caring about embarrassment. Embarrassment is for people who still have something to protect. I sold my electrical contracting business in October 2019. 23 employees, a fleet of 8 vans, 2 decades of commercial contracts. I'd built it from absolutely nothing. Started with a ute, a toolbox, and a Yellow Pages listing, and I sold it for AUD $410,000 to a larger outfit from Melbourne who'd been circling for 3 years. After tax, after the accountant and the lawyer took their fees, after I paid out my partner who'd invested early and deserved every cent, I was left with 380,000 Australian dollars, roughly £215,000 at the exchange rate that year. I was 60 years old. I had money in the bank for the first time in my adult life, and I had absolutely no idea what to do with myself. The first 3 months back in Sydney were fine. I painted the house. I fixed the gutters that had been sagging for years because I'd always been too busy with other people's gutters to attend to my own. I had lunch with my daughter in Manly on a Friday and didn't have to check my phone once. But by February 2020, when the world started shutting down and I found myself locked in a 3-bedroom house in Penrith with nothing but a television and a retirement plan I hadn't actually made yet, something shifted. Not dramatically. Just a quiet, creeping restlessness that I didn't have a name for at the time. I know what to call it now. I was terrified of being irrelevant. I'd been to Thailand twice before on fishing trips with mates from the trade. Khao Lak, both times. Nothing fancy. Beer, fish, sunburn, and a sense that the place operated at a pace that suited my nervous system better than Sydney ever had. When a bloke I'd known for 30 years, a sparky named Greg who'd retired to Chiang Mai in 2017, started sending me photos of his daily life up there, I started to pay attention. He was walking markets at 6 in the morning, eating noodles for 40 baht, which he told me was roughly 80 cents, photographing temples at sunset. He looked 20 years younger than he had at his retirement party. I called him in April 2020, during the first lockdown, and we talked for 2 hours. By the end of the call, I'd already decided, even if I couldn't admit it to myself yet, I just needed a plan. I arrived in Chiang Mai on a Thursday in March 2021. I had a tourist visa I'd organized through the Thai consulate in Sydney, a backpack that was heavier than it needed to be, and the kind of unearned confidence that comes from reading about a place for 9 months without actually understanding any of it. Greg met me at the airport. He looked exactly like his photos. Tanned, relaxed, wearing a linen shirt that somehow didn't look ridiculous on a 63-year-old man from Wollongong. We drove into the old city with the windows down, and I remember the smell of jasmine garlands, and something frying in oil, and the warm weight of the air. And I thought, yes, whatever this is what I came for. Greg had set up his life well. He lived in a comfortable house near Nimman Road, the neighborhood the expats called Nimman, and he'd found a rhythm that suited him. Morning coffee, Afternoon market, evening dinner with friends. No agenda, no pressure, no clocks. He introduced me to his circle, a mix of British, Australian, and American retirees, a few digital nomads, a Thai-English couple who ran a guest house, and I felt, for the first time since I'd sold the business, that I was in the right place. Not just visiting, actually, in the right place. I met Mint on my 4th day. I want to be precise about this because the sequence matters. It wasn't a bar. I want to be clear about that because the assumption is always that Farang, foreign men, in Thailand, meet women in bars, and that's what this is. It wasn't. I met her at a restaurant on the eastern edge of the old city, a small place that Greg had taken me to for dinner. Pad See Ew, wide noodles with egg and Chinese broccoli. That was better than anything I'd eaten in my life, served at plastic tables under fluorescent lights, with a ceiling fan that rotated at exactly the right speed. Mint was the cashier. She was 26 years old, with a steady gaze and a kind of composed efficiency that I noticed before I noticed anything else about her. She gave me my change in exact coins, said something to Greg in Thai that made him laugh, and when I asked what she'd said, Greg told me she'd said that I looked like a man who hadn't eaten a proper meal in months, which was true. I'd been surviving on toast and baked beans in Penrith for 3 months. She was there the next night when Greg and I went back, and the night after that. By the end of the first week, we'd exchanged numbers, she'd asked, not me, which felt significant at the time, and she'd taken me to a morning market near Warorat that I never would have found on my own, where we ate cow tom, rice porridge, standing at a stall, and she explained, with a mixture of Thai and broken English, the difference between northern and central Thai food. She spoke English better than she let on initially, I realized later. She deployed it in careful portions. I know what you're thinking. I thought it too, for about 48 hours. Then I stopped thinking it, which was my first mistake. Within 3 weeks, I was seeing Mint every day. Within 5 weeks, she had a key to the guest house room I'd moved into. Within 2 months, we'd had the conversation about the future, her future, specifically, which she described with a practicality that I found refreshing after the emotional chaos of a divorce I'd been through in 2014. She wanted stability. She wanted something of her own. She was tired of shift work and the uncertainty of restaurant employment. She said all of this matter-of-factly, without drama, the way you'd describe a business plan rather than a romantic aspiration. I found it enormously appealing. I'd spent 6 years rebuilding myself after my marriage ended, and I was exhausted by feelings. Here was a woman who talked about the future the way I thought about electrical contracts. Assess the situation, identify the requirements, execute. She mentioned about 6 weeks in that she'd always dreamed of running her own restaurant. Not the place she worked at. That belonged to the owner's family, and there was no future in it for her. Something of her own. She knew what she'd do differently. Better menu, proper ventilation, table service instead of counter service, a clean kitchen she could be proud of. She had opinions about every detail. I remember sitting across from her at a street food stall near the Ping River, listening to her talk about kitchen layout and supplier relationships and thinking, this woman is wasted at a cash register. She told me about her background in those weeks, piece by piece, the way you learn about someone when you're both being careful. She'd grown up in a village about 40 kilometers east of Chiang Mai, the younger of 2 daughters in a family that had farmed until the farm stopped being viable, which happened to a lot of families in the north during the years she was growing up. Her father had retrained as a motorcycle mechanic. Her mother cleaned rooms at a resort outside the city. Mint had come to Chiang Mai at 19 to find work, spent 2 years waitressing at a tourist restaurant on the Night Bazaar Strip, then moved to the place where I'd met her when the pay was slightly better and the hours were more predictable. She'd been cashier there for 3 years when I arrived. She sent money home every month, a fixed amount, not variable, which she described as a kind of family obligation rather than a choice. I found that admirable. I still find it admirable, in the abstract, even now. The obligation to family is real. What I was too slow to understand was that the obligation extended in directions I hadn't anticipated, and that I was going to be asked to fulfill it on behalf of people I'd never met. She also told me about her sister Dang in those early weeks, though not in the way that later made sense. She described Dang as the practical one, the organized one, the one who'd managed to make something of herself in the city. Dang ran a small textile import business out of a shophouse in the eastern part of Chiang Mai, buying fabric from suppliers in the north and selling to tailors and small clothing makers. Mint said she admired her sister's business instincts. She said it without any particular emphasis. I stored it as background and moved on. I told Greg about it on a Tuesday evening over beers at a place near his house. He'd been living in Chiang Mai for 4 years by then, and he'd seen everything. He listened, said nothing for a long moment, and then told me about a man he knew, a retired civil engineer from Bristol named Alan, who'd put his life savings into a bar in Pai with his Thai girlfriend and lost every penny in 18 months. Alan thought his situation was different, Greg said. Everyone thinks their situation is different. He wasn't cruel about it. He said it the way you'd say it to a friend, gently, with genuine concern. I thanked him for the advice. I told him I heard him. I told him I wasn't making any decisions yet. I was just getting to know her. What I didn't tell him was that I'd already started thinking about numbers. By October 2021, I had applied for and received a non-immigrant B visa, officially for business purposes, through an agent Mint's friend had recommended. I'd moved out of the guest house and into a rented apartment near the Chiang Mai night bazaar that Mint had found. She paid half the rent from her cashier wages, a fact I noted with approval at the time as evidence of her intentions. I've thought about that since. It's a common element, apparently, the early display of financial contribution, small enough to be token, large enough to register as evidence of good faith. At the time, I thought it was admirable. She was investing in us. I didn't think about what she might be expecting in return. We talked about the restaurant seriously for the first time in November. We were in the apartment on a rainy Sunday, and she had a notebook, an actual physical notebook, not a phone, with pages of planning, supplier contacts, estimated monthly operating costs, a location she'd already identified near the Nimman area, close enough to the tourist corridor to benefit from foot traffic, but set back enough to attract local regulars as well. She'd visited it 3 times already. She knew the landlord. She had figures. The initial outlay she estimated was somewhere between 3.5 and 4.2 million baht, which at the exchange rate that November worked out to between roughly £78,000 and £94,000, covering fit-out, kitchen equipment, first 6 months' rent, licensing, and working capital. She said it carefully, watching my face. She wasn't asking. She was presenting. I asked her why she'd come to me with this. She looked at me like the question confused her. "You want future together," she said. "I want future. This is future. And then, I cannot do this alone. Thai bank will not give loan to single woman my age without big guarantee. But together, with your savings, is possible." She said it simply, without manipulation, or what felt without manipulation. That's the thing about manipulation at this level. It doesn't feel like manipulation. It feels like honesty. I transferred 1.5 million baht, approximately £33,500 at the time, as a first tranche in December 2021. I told myself it was exploratory, a down payment on a dream, not a commitment to any particular outcome. I told Greg it was a small business investment, and I was being careful. He nodded without commenting. I recognized that nod later for what it was. The restaurant registered in January 2022. I remember the day we went to the Chiang Mai Business Development Office to complete the paperwork. It was a Tuesday, early morning, and the office had that particular government building energy of slow ceilings and harsh light. Mint had brought all the documents. She handled everything. I speak perhaps 40 words of Thai. Numbers, pleasantries, the basic vocabulary of a man who's been in a country for 9 months. And the paperwork was in Thai. There was a man there who spoke some English and offered to translate the key sections, and he told me what the documents were for: business registration, license application, initial financial declarations. I signed where Mint pointed. I remember she was calm throughout the entire process. Competent. She thanked the official by name, which impressed me. She knew people. She was someone who knew people. What I didn't know, what I didn't ask, because I didn't know the question to ask, was who was named as sole business director on those documents. I assumed it was structured as a partnership. I assumed my financial contribution created a legal stake. I assumed a lot of things that day that I had no basis for assuming. The restaurant opened in March 2022. We called it Baan Fern, Baan meaning house or home. It was a genuinely beautiful space. Mint had supervised every detail of the fit-out personally. Raw concrete walls with warm lighting, teak furniture, a kitchen pass-through that let diners see the cooking. The menu was Northern Thai with some innovation. She'd worked with a cook from her home village outside Chiang Mai who made a dry curry that people were already talking about on Facebook by the second week. I was there every day in the beginning. I seated people, I poured water, I learned the names of regulars. I was happy. That's the thing I want you to understand. During those first 3 months, I was genuinely happy in a way I hadn't been in years. The place felt like mine. It felt like something I'd built. Looking back, I can trace the shape of those early weeks very precisely. The opening night, when we were overwhelmed with reservations and ran out of the dry curry by 8 o'clock, and Mint was laughing in the kitchen at the chaos of it. The first morning I came in early to help with prep, and found her already there at 5:30, making stock from scratch, and she looked up at me without surprise, as if she'd known I'd come. The evening a food blogger from Bangkok posted about the khao soi, northern-style curry noodle soup, and the reservations inbox filled up overnight. These memories are real. I'm not going to tell you they weren't. The restaurant was genuinely good. The food was genuinely good. The pride I felt standing at the door on a Saturday night watching a full room eat well, that was real too. I invested in something that actually worked, and the cruelty of the whole thing is that the working of it was never the question. The question was always whose hands it was working in. I wasn't on the lease. I wasn't named in the business registration. My name appeared on nothing except the bank transfer records, which were denominated in my Australian account and meant nothing under Thai commercial law. I didn't know any of this yet. By April, I'd transferred the remaining investment in 3 further tranches. 800,000 baht in December 2021 for kitchen equipment, 1.1 million baht in February 2022 for fit-out, and a final 600,000 baht in March for working capital, totaling 4 million baht, approximately 89,000 pounds at the rates that year. With my initial transfer and some miscellaneous costs along the way, I was sitting at roughly 128,000 pounds invested in the restaurant by the time we opened. Mint's older sister Dang appeared in the picture around the same time the restaurant opened. Mint had mentioned her before. She was 10 years older, had managed a small textile business in the city, understood finances and operations. It made sense for Dang to be involved in the management side, Mint explained, since Mint herself would be focused on the kitchen and front of house. Dang arrived at the restaurant on the second Sunday it was open and introduced herself to me with the kind of formal warmth that suggested she'd been briefed on exactly who I was and how to handle me. She was competent and organized, and I liked her. I remember thinking she was an asset. I was not wrong about that, precisely. I was just wrong about whose asset she was. I want to tell you about the ceiling fan. There was a ceiling fan in the back office at Baan Fern, a small room behind the kitchen where we kept the paperwork and the float and the daily takings. One of the blades was slightly unbalanced, and it made a clicking sound on every rotation. Mild, rhythmic, easy to ignore. I noticed it the first week and told Mint I'd fix it. She said it was fine. It wasn't bothering anyone. I forgot about it. By July, I'd started using the office more frequently. I was handling supplier invoices and cash reconciliation, while Mint managed the floor, and I heard that clicking every single day. I kept meaning to fix it. I never did. I think about that fan now because it was the soundtrack to everything I was failing to pay attention to while I sat at that desk doing what I thought was my job. The first thing I noticed was small. In July 2022, I was reconciling a week's takings against the point-of-sale records, and the numbers didn't match. Not dramatically. We were down about 4,200 baht on a week's revenue, which was roughly £95. I mentioned it to Mint. She looked at the records, said something in Thai to Dang, who was standing nearby, and then told me the system had probably miscounted a split bill. She seemed unbothered. I accepted it. The next week, the variance was 6,800 baht. I noted it in the margin of the ledger. The week after, everything balanced correctly. I convinced myself the system had been glitchy. What I didn't do was ask the pointed question. I didn't say, "Show me the bank account statements for the business operating account." I didn't say, "Show me the legal registration documents with my name on them." I didn't say the things a man with any business sense would say, because I'd decided, consciously or not, that the restaurant was hers and I was a supporting actor in her story. That's what I'd told myself. That I was helping. That the help was the point. Helping people was my whole career. I made sure the power worked in other people's buildings. It never occurred to me to check whether I was on the deed. By August, I was noticing other things. Mint's phone was face down on the table more often than it wasn't. She had taken to leaving the restaurant at lunchtime, a quiet period, which I'd always handled alone, to meet Dang for what she described as supplier discussions. When I asked who they were meeting, she named a produce distributor in the eastern part of the city. I had no reason to doubt her. There were also the calls she took outside. Not many, 2 or 3 a week, but she always stepped out through the kitchen to the alley behind the restaurant, and when she came back she was sometimes quieter than before, like she was processing something. I noticed and I said nothing, because I'd already categorized these observations as cultural adjustment. She comes from a different family culture. She handles family business differently to the way I'd handle it. Not everything that looks like a secret is a secret. Her grandmother got sick in September. I never met the grandmother. She lived in a village east of Chiang Mai that I'd passed through once on a drive but never visited. Mint got a call on a Friday evening and her face changed. She was at the cash register, and I watched the shift happen. The composure dropped for a moment, and then she recovered it. She told me her grandmother needed hospital treatment. Gallstones, she said. Surgery and recovery and medication. The cost, she said, was going to be around 85,000 baht. She said her family would help cover some of it, but they were struggling. She didn't ask directly. She told me, and then she waited. I transferred 85,000 baht, about £1,900, from my Australian account to hers that Sunday. She thanked me once and never mentioned it again. I thought that was her dignity. She didn't want to dwell on needing help. I respected that. I've replayed that transfer in my head many times since, and what I understand now is that the silence afterwards isn't dignity, it's the reset. You make the transfer, it gets absorbed without ceremony, and then the normal state resumes. No drama. No excess gratitude that might make the next request feel awkward. Clean, professional management of the transaction. The grandmother's surgery was a success. I know this because Mint told me. 2 weeks after the transfer, there was no follow-up cost, no complications, no hospital bill that required my involvement. Clean, complete, move on. Then one morning in October, I got a call from a man whose name I'll give as Kun Natapong, a man I'd met at a supplier's warehouse, who occasionally came into the restaurant for lunch. He was a food and beverage distributor. He'd been supplying the restaurant with dried goods and canned product since we opened. He called me on a Tuesday morning when I was at the apartment, not yet at the restaurant, and he said, carefully, in his measured English, that he wanted to check something with me. He said he'd been contacted by a new account manager for Baan Fern, not Mint, not Dang, but someone else, who was requesting a change to the billing name on all outstanding invoices. The new billing name, he said, was a company he didn't recognize. He wanted to confirm this was authorized before he made any changes. I should say here that I'd missed an earlier signal, and Natapong's call made it surface. 2 weeks prior, I'd been reviewing the produce delivery invoices in the office, and noticed that one of the regular supplier names, a fresh vegetable outfit from the Mae Rim area north of the city, had been replaced in the records with a different supplier I didn't recognize. I'd asked Mint about it. She said the old supplier's quality had dropped and Dang had found a better alternative. It was reasonable. Supplier changes happen. I'd written it in the ledger and moved on. Looking back, I think that was a test. Not a conscious test, perhaps, but a probe. She gave me an explanation that was plausible enough to satisfy me, watched me accept it, and filed away the information that I would accept plausible explanations. The invoice change with Natapong was larger and bolder, and it came only because he, unlike me, had a reason to verify things independently. His concern was his own billing records. Mine should have been too. I told him I'd call him back. I sat on the edge of the bed in the apartment for a long time. Probably 15 minutes, maybe longer. I was aware of the traffic noise outside, and the way the light was coming through the curtain, and I remember thinking very specifically that this was the call that Greg had been warning me about 9 months ago. I didn't move. I just sat there with the phone in my hand, while the information arranged itself into a shape I didn't want to look at. I called Mint. She answered on the second ring, cheerful, asking if I was coming in soon. I told her about the call from Natapong. There was a pause, short, barely perceptible, and then she said she'd handle it, that it was probably an administrative change Dang had requested for tax purposes. She said it so easily. She said it the way you'd explain something obvious to someone who was worried for no reason, and I wanted to believe her. I was 61 years old. I'd put £128,000 into this restaurant, and I wanted very much to believe that administrative changes for tax purposes were a real thing that happened, and that this was one of them. But I didn't hang up immediately. I said, "Whose name is the restaurant registered in?" And she said, "Mine. We already knew this." I said, "Yes, but is Dang's name anywhere on the registration?" She said, "No. Why would it be?" And something in the way she answered that, the speed of it, the completeness of the deflection, told me I was asking the wrong question. I found a Thai-speaking solicitor the following day through the expat community. His name was Kun Wan Chai, and he worked from an office near the night bazaar. I explained the situation as clearly as I could. The investment, the business registration, the transfer, Natapong's call. He listened without expression, and then asked me to bring any documents I had. I brought the transfer records from my bank, the original supplier agreements I'd signed, and a photograph of the business registration certificate that hung on the wall of the restaurant, which I'd photographed on my phone without telling Mint I'd done so. Wan Chai looked at the photograph of the registration certificate for a while. Then he looked at me. He explained that under Thai commercial law, as a foreign national, I could not be a director or majority owner of a Thai-registered business without a specific business license structure that we had not used. The restaurant, as registered, was a 100% Thai-owned entity, with Mint as sole director. My transfers were not equity. They were not loans. There was no loan agreement in place. They were, in legal terms, gifts. There was no mechanism under Thai law by which I could claim ownership of any portion of the business based on the documents I'd provided. I want to tell you what that moment felt like. I want to describe it accurately, not dramatically. I didn't collapse. I didn't shout. I sat in a white plastic chair in a small office near the night bazaar, with the sound of tuk-tuks outside and a ceiling fan clicking. Not the same fan as at the restaurant, but the same sound, and I remember noticing that. And I felt my understanding of the past 14 months reorganize itself completely. Not slowly. All at once. Like when you look at one of those optical illusions, and suddenly the old woman is a young woman, and you cannot make it go back. I could not make the past 14 months go back. What Wan Chai told me next was worse. He had contacted the business registration office to verify the certificate details. The registration had been amended 6 weeks earlier. There was now a co-director listed on the business, not Mint, Dang, Mint's sister. I went to the restaurant that afternoon. Mint was there, at the pass-through window, talking to the cook about something. She smiled when I came in. Genuinely, warmly, the same smile as always. I asked her to come to the office. She followed me in, and I closed the door, and I heard the ceiling fan clicking above us. I told her what Wanchai had found. I told her about the amendment to the registration. I told her I knew that Deng was now a co-director. I said it all calmly, because I'm a man who spent 40 years in situations where losing your composure can get someone electrocuted, and that discipline doesn't leave you. Mint didn't raise her voice either. She let me finish. And then she said, "This is my business. Thai business. You cannot own Thai business. I told you this from the beginning." She hadn't. She absolutely had not. But she said it with such certainty that for a moment I doubted my own memory. Dying helps now because we need more support with management. This is normal. She said the word normal with enormous emphasis, as if the problem was my failure to understand normality. I asked her why she hadn't told me. She looked at me with an expression I still can't fully categorize. Not guilt, not contempt, something more like impatience, and she said, "You never asked." And then she walked out of the office and back to the floor. I stood in that office with the fan clicking, and I did not move for a long time. Over the following 10 days, with Wanchai's help, I began to piece together what had actually happened. The business registration amended to include Deng had been filed on a date that I was able to cross-reference against my own calendar. It was filed 4 days after I'd made my final capital transfer in March. The timing suggested planning. It suggested that the amendment had been intended all along, held in reserve until the full investment was received. There was a further detail that took me longer to find. The commercial lease for the restaurant premises, the physical space, the rent agreement with the landlord, had been transferred to a new tenancy entity 2 weeks prior to my visit to Wanchai. The new tenancy name was a company I didn't recognize. When Wanchai traced it, the registered address was Deng's home address, and the sole director was Deng. The restaurant's physical lease was no longer in Mint's name. It was in Deng's company. The business that I'd funded, the kitchen equipment I'd paid for, the fit-out, the decor, the supplier relationships, the name, Baan Fern, were now operating from premises controlled entirely by Deng. Mint retained directorship of the original business entity, but as Wanchai explained, that entity now had no lease, no premises, and no operating assets. It was an empty shell. The operational restaurant, the thing I'd built with £128,000 of trade money, was running under Deng's company, in Deng's name. I confronted Mint properly 2 days after this, not in the restaurant. I asked her to meet me at a coffee shop near the apartment. I laid out what Wanchai had found. I was precise. I used figures and dates. Mint listened to all of it with her hands around a glass of iced tea and her face absolutely still. When I finished, she said, "I did nothing illegal." And she was right. That's the part that should be repeated, loudly, to anyone thinking about doing what I did. She did nothing illegal, not under Thai commercial law. Every transfer I'd made was voluntary and undocumented as anything other than a personal transfer. The business registration was legally hers. The lease transfer to Deng's company was a private commercial transaction between 2 Thai nationals. My position in any Thai court would be, as Wanchai put it, extremely difficult. I asked her why. I know that's a foolish question. I asked it anyway. She looked at me for a moment with something that might have been sadness, or might have been calculation, and she said, "Brian, I need to think about my family. My sister has nothing. I have something now. This is how we do." And then she picked up her iced tea and left. I called Greg that evening. He came over, sat in the apartment, and listened. He didn't say "I told you so," at least not with words. He said he was sorry. He said he'd seen versions of this happen 3 times in 4 years, and it never got less brutal. He asked what I was going to do. I told him I was going to see a lawyer about recovery options. He nodded slowly. He didn't say what he was thinking, which I suspect was that there were no recovery options. He was right, of course. Wanchai was honest with me across 2 further meetings. The money was not recoverable. The business was not recoverable. The correct path, if I wanted one, was to file a civil claim on the basis of unjust enrichment, but the evidentiary bar was extremely high. Without a written loan agreement or equity document, the process would take years, and I'd be fighting it from Australia on a budget that was already depleted. More to the point, Mint hadn't taken the money illegally. She'd accepted it as offered. The manipulation was social, not legal. I spent a week in the apartment going over the numbers. I had my laptop and a spreadsheet, and several evenings that I spent without eating or sleeping properly, which I wouldn't recommend but couldn't seem to stop. The total I arrived at was £230,000. That included the restaurant investment, the cash transfers I'd made for the apartment lease top-ups when things were tight, the grandmother's surgery, 2 separate loans to Mint's brother for motorcycle repairs, and education fees that I'd been told were temporary but were never returned, and the cost of the non-immigrant B visa application and the agent who'd helped me maintain it. £230,000, about 610,000 Australian dollars. Roughly 2/3 of everything I'd received for the business I'd spent 40 years building. I left Chiang Mai on a Tuesday in December 2022. I didn't have a departure scene with Mint. I sent her a message saying I was going. She replied with 2 words, "Safe trip." I packed a suitcase and left everything else, furniture, kitchen gear, a box of books I'd accumulated, in the apartment. I took one last drive through the old city at 6 in the morning, which I know sounds theatrical, but it wasn't. I just needed to see it before I got to the airport. I'd loved Chiang Mai. I'd loved it genuinely. The place itself had done nothing wrong. The airport was quiet at that hour. I sat in the departure lounge with a cup of coffee, and I did the calculation one more time in my head. Not the money. The time. I was 60 when I arrived. I was 62 when I left. In those 2 years I had been, for stretches of them, genuinely happy in a way I hadn't been since before my marriage started failing. That's the part I can't fully resolve. The happiness wasn't fake. The food was real. The city was real. The morning markets and the cooking smells and the sense of possibility were all real. What wasn't real was the partnership. What wasn't real was the shared future. What wasn't real was the idea that I had any stake in anything that would outlast my presence in that country. I'm back in New South Wales now. I've been back for 18 months. I'm renting a house in the Central Coast, not Sydney, too expensive, from a woman I went to school with who gives me a reasonable rate because she feels sorry for me, though she'd never say it that way. I work 3 days a week for an electrical outfit in Gosford, not running the business. On the tools again, which is either humiliating or grounding depending on which day you ask me. My daughter came up from Sydney last month, and we had lunch, and she didn't mention Thailand. She's kind, my daughter. She knew about it almost from the beginning. I'd told her when I was still in Chiang Mai, before I understood the full scope of it, and she said all the right things. She's never said I told you so either. Maybe nobody really says it out loud. Maybe they all just say it with that particular silence. There was a man in my daughter's suburb whose story I heard about through a mutual friend, months after I got back. He was a retired British teacher, 65, who'd done almost exactly what I'd done, except in Pattaya, and with a guest house instead of a restaurant. He'd invested his pension lump sum into the guest house under his Thai partner's name, because that was the legal structure available, and spent 3 years managing it before she met someone else and he was asked, politely, to leave the premises that he'd funded. He was back in Coventry, working at a B&Q. I heard this secondhand and I didn't reach out to him, though I thought about it. What would I have said? That I understood? He already knew I understood. We all understand each other perfectly. That's the saddest part of this particular brotherhood. The complete clarity we have about each other's decisions, and how useless that clarity is after the fact. Mint is still running Baan Fern. I know this because I looked it up on Facebook 6 months ago, which I shouldn't have done but did. The restaurant has new signage. The business is in Deng's company name now in all the promotional materials, with Mint listed as head chef. They have good reviews. The dry curry is still on the menu. In one of the photos you can see the back wall I chose, the exposed brick that I'd specifically asked the contractor to keep rather than plaster over. And it looks exactly right. It looks exactly the way I'd imagined it. I've thought a lot about what to say to you at the end of this. I've rehearsed versions of it in my head on the drive to work and at night when I can't sleep, which is more often than I'd like. Here's what I've settled on. The system didn't fail me. I wasn't cheated by some loophole or caught by a technicality. I gave away my money voluntarily, without documentation, to someone who never had any legal obligation to return it or account for it. I did this because I wanted to believe that trust was sufficient. I wanted to believe that the feelings were the contract. I'm a man who spent 40 years making sure electrical systems were safe and documented and compliant with code. And when it came to the most significant financial decision of my retirement, I signed documents I didn't read and transferred money without a single piece of paper to my name. That's not a Thailand problem. That's a Brian problem. I need you to hear that clearly, because the easiest version of this story is the one where Thailand is the villain, and that version lets you off the hook. It lets you think you'd know better. You probably wouldn't. I thought I would. If you are reading this because you're somewhere in this story right now, early in it, trusting someone, feeling certain about a future you've decided to build in a country that doesn't recognize your ownership of anything, I'm asking you to do one thing. Get a lawyer. Not a local contact, not someone your partner's friend recommended. Find an independent Thai solicitor who has no connection to anyone in your circle and pay them for an hour of their time. Show them every document. Ask them whose name is on everything. Ask them what you would be entitled to if you left tomorrow. Do it this week. Do it before any more money moves. I'm 62 years old. I'm back on the tools in Gosford. I've got enough in the bank to cover rent and the ute payment and groceries. And if I work carefully for the next 8 years, I might retire with something modest. I don't say that for sympathy. I say it so the number is real to you. Not £230,000 in the abstract. Not some figure on a screen. But a man who spent 40 years building something, getting to the end of it, and then spending 2 years undoing every bit of it because he wanted to believe that electricity can flow both ways. It can't. That's not how current works. Power goes where the circuit allows it to go. And if you don't check the circuit, you don't control where it ends up. I should have known that.